Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 25. So this past weekend was the Medium Festival of Photography here in San Diego, and I'm just going to level with you here. After 4 days of being totally immersed in art and photography and meeting people and talking about my work, I'm pretty wiped out. I'll tell you what, though. The festival is always one of the highlights of my whole year, so I would just like to take a second, give a little shout out to Medium's founder, Scott B. Davis, plus all the staff and volunteers for making it another great year. I had sort of an unexpected thing happen this year, which was that through all of the portfolio reviews I sat for, I didn't get a single negative review or even any major criticisms, which is not something that's ever happened before. I'm still kind of processing all of it, trying to figure out what's next, where to go with my work. But there's this question I've been thinking about the past couple of days, sort of turning it over in my mind, and that's this. If you were to let go of your insecurities and anxieties and self-doubt and all the limiting beliefs that you had about yourself, what would you be? And what would you do? I'm not really sure for myself, but it can be kind of a scary thing to contemplate because the way you think about yourself tends to be pretty deep-rooted, and even the negative parts of that can be comfortable or even comforting. And letting go of bits of your identity, even the bad parts or the toxic parts, there's a certain pain to that, a certain fear. But, maybe it's worth finding out. Maybe you've got something in there that's worth seeing. Maybe I do too, who knows? Anyway, on to today's show. Today's guest is photographer Emitt Adams. David is well known for his work with historic photographic processes, and one of the things I love about his work is how physical it is, because rather than just making prints or, say, glass plates, he uses techniques like wet plate photography to make photographs on all kinds of objects, and the conversation between the image and the object it's on gives it that much more impact. David has exhibited his work widely, both nationally and internationally. He has work in major collections, including the Museum of Photographic Arts here in San Diego and the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona, including others. And recently he won the 2016 Clarence John Laughlin Award from the New Orleans Photo Alliance. One more bit of background that's relevant to the conversation. You might remember back in episode 10 that I talked with photographer Claire Warden. Well, David is Claire's husband, so when you hear her name come up, that's who we're talking about. Anyway, why don't we jump in? Here's my conversation with Emitt Adams. So I've been following your work for a few years now, and I'm trying to think. I've seen it in a few different places now that I think of it. I know I saw it most recently at the Etherton Gallery. I think this was about a year and a half ago. And I've also seen it at some shows around the San Diego area. But I think the first time I ever saw your work was when you brought your 36 Exposures project to the Medium Festival.
Yeah. When was that? 2012?
Something 10? Like that. I think that's right. I think it was the first year.
Yeah, the first year.
Yeah. It's funny how, over the course of this podcast, like a whole bunch of the people that I've talked to the first time I met them was at that particular Medium Festival.
Yeah, I was actually talking to Claire about that today and how you and Scott should probably link up and make this official somehow.
Yeah. Well, one of these days maybe. Scott's a really busy guy.
I know, right?
Yeah, he's got so much stuff going on, and just even on top of his own practice. So I'm always impressed with what he's got cooking all the time.
Right.
Yeah, but so that series, the 36 Exposures. So this was sort of my introduction to your work, and there are some themes in it that are sort of carried through. Really the rest of your more recent series, it seems to me. You think?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because before that series, I was very much a straightforward photographer in the sense that I was using large format and shooting black and white and very traditional.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's actually a series I did prior to 36 exposures that I've kind of kept underground. It's not on my website. I show it, but not very often.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually the series that kind of opened my mind to the possibilities of photography. And that is Celestial Sphere. And it's a body of work that I did about stars and trying to create what I was thinking other than documenting what I was seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And so from that body of work, I kind of got the sense of, well, what is photography and what can I do with it? And I was studying wet plate collodion at the time, and I was recycling material and just kind of trying to source everything for free rather than buying new metal and material. And I set up a recycle bin in my Photo 1 students' classroom and ended up seeing all these 35 millimeter film canisters and knew I had to use them to make art with.
Mm-hmm.
And what ended up happening is I sat on the project for a while and I wasn't sure what I wanted to make photographs of with them. But I knew I had to make it poignant to photography because these objects in and of themselves had so much to do with photography and learning and my students. So what ended up happening is that I made photographs of my students at the time on the 35 millimeter film canisters that played a role in their education into photography.
Yeah, it's such an interesting idea. I feel like starting around maybe 2010, 2011, I started seeing a lot of people sort of being more interested in alternative processes, collodion and cyanotypes and other kind of historic things. But I feel like for a lot of people, they just sort of stop at the step of, well, I'm going to use this process, but it's not necessarily integral to the work. It's more just like a technique that they're using.
Sure.
And I feel like your work was one of the ones that I saw early on and when I was sort of learning about photography that really, makes use of the potential of that particular process to do something where it's really integral to the work, to the sort of the concept and theme of the work. And this thing about that particular project, the 36 exposures, it's interesting to me because it's so tangibly about photography as a medium, and I just find that really interesting.
Yeah, I think it is important. It's something that I've always loved photography. I've always loved the craft of it. I've always loved the darkroom.
Mm-hmm.
I think the medium's important, and to speak of the medium while you're using it, I think kind of just re-emphasizes that importance.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that happened mostly in 36 exposures. But yeah, I wasn't familiar with historic photo processes before graduate school.
Mm-hmm.
I never had any education in that realm, aside from I did 2 weeks with John Coffer prior to graduate school, who taught me wet plate collodion. And I kind of just ran with it and tried to think through ideas conceptually rather than just, using the process.
Yeah. I mean, that's such a big leap, I think, that in order to really become an artist in a meaningful way, being able to take that step, especially as a photographer, but I think really in any discipline, being able to understand sort of why you're doing it instead of just what you're doing, it can be a difficult place to reach, especially when you're young, I feel like. But that is sort of, to me anyway, what really defines the artist,
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's definitely a hard dance because once you start it, then you don't want to go too far with it. You don't want it to actually hurt the idea rather than support it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the end result is through going too far and then dialing it back. And, I always try to push things as far as I can conceptually and see where that leads. And then I can always dial it back down to find where it fits.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's another thing, a lot of times when we're working, it's really only by, like you don't grow until you're pushing things until they break, really. Like it's not until you've failed at something that you can figure out what it is you're doing, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with that.
Yeah.
And it allows you to get comfortable with that as well,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, experimentation it can be scary, especially when you're first starting out. But it seems to me like it's sort of a key thing to growth.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things that I, particularly about this 36 exposures series that I think is really intriguing is, so you have the wet plate collodion process that you're using. And this is, as you said, it's a historic process. I think it's something on the order of 120 something years old, something like that.
Yeah.
And
which in the scheme of things is not very long at all.
Right. Although photography itself is relatively new.
Yeah.
But I mean, you can't we all have associations with tintypes, pictures that look that way, and having a real historical sort of connotation. And then the fact that you're printing these pictures, or actually not printing, but exposing pictures on used film canisters, but that these film canisters come from students in your class. These are all things that your students actually used and touched, and so it's an interesting way of I think photography so often is very concerned with history and with the past, but this series is really both. It's the past and the future through the medium and the subject matter, I think that's exciting.
Thank you. I think so too. And I think about my projects not only right now, but hundreds of years from now. What will they say about when I was here and what I was looking at and what I was trying to convey and talk about? And it's really interesting to see some of those students continue on in their pursuit of photography.
Mm-hmm.
And so hopefully, more than one or two will continue it, and the cycle will continue, and they'll have something to show and talk about down the line.
Yeah. I know a lot of artists I've talked to have done some amount of teaching. Is that something that you find, how does that affect your practice?
Well, I haven't been teaching since, or I have not. Let's see, when's the last class I taught? It's been a couple years now. I've just fully taken on the art world, and but when I was teaching, I teach workshops. I shouldn't say I don't teach, but I do teach collodion workshops and a few other workshops locally. But students are always energetic. There's always an extra level of energy and questions and concerns that they bring to the table that could possibly push you, the teacher, to the next level or the next concept in your art. And, I've seen my teachers do that with some of their graduate students in the past. So, there's no doubt that students influence what's happening in the professor's artistic career as well.
Yeah, I always, I haven't been a teacher myself, but my wife was an elementary school teacher, and I did a lot of tutoring with high school students when I was in college. And it's, I think, something that a lot of people don't really realize is exactly how much back and forth there can be between the teacher and the student. You have this sort of impression of teaching being sort of like a teacher standing up on a pedestal, and sort of dispensing wisdom, but it's really a lot more conversational than that.
Oh, absolutely. And I definitely think that's the case for art school as well.
Mm-hmm. So moving on a little further, your the next series of yours that I have seen this is Conversations with History, and this is I actually got a chance. I've been aware of this because of, I think I saw it on Lens Scratch first.
Okay.
But then I actually got a chance to see it when when you and Claire had a joint exhibition at I can't remember which college it was.
Maricosta.
Yeah, it was in Oceanside.
Yep.
Yeah, and there's something, about, so just to describe it, so you're taking the same process, the wet play collodion process, and you're using it to create images that are on like old cans and junk that you find in the desert. Right?
Yeah, it sounds pretty crazy.
This process, not the process, but the end result, to me, it really, for me, is like a perfect example of work that you can't really experience other than being in the same room with it,
I do know, and it's very hard to put it out in the world digitally because it flattens everything out.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I this series, I guess I wonder, just to start with, like what the genesis of this project was, like how it came about.
Well, it's definitely snowballed off of 36 exposures. 36 exposures really opened the door to my thinking about photography in a different way. And I got to the point of, well, what else can I make a photograph on that speaks to the nature of what I'm photographing and what my interests are? And, I do a lot of camping. I'm in the desert a lot. And there's, trash from yesterday all the way back, 100 years. You can find stuff that people have dumped in the desert. It was a common practice for trains that were coming from the east to the west to upload water before coming through and while coming through. And when they'd stop, they'd just unload all the trash. And their trash back then happened to be cans. And so you can find literally an endless supply of art material for me and trash for other people.
Mm-hmm.
But I think those objects and the history of leaving stuff behind and leaving traces of our advancements in our culture all are tied up in these objects and location.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I find really the most interesting about like tintypes in particular, but really analog photography in general. One of the things that really separates it from digital photography, from sort of like a philosophical point of view, and nothing against digital photography, like
right.
I'm a digital photographer almost exclusively, but one of the things I find most interesting about analog photography, and particularly these historic processes, is that you have to expose, like the final object that you get, you're exposing the image at the location of the image. So that thing that you're looking at in the museum actually was in the place where where is depicted.
Yeah, and not only that, it's like it is the light that was bouncing off those objects.
Right.
Back into the camera, right onto the plate,
mm-hmm.
exposing that silver. So, yeah, you can think of it that way. Absolutely, conceptually, it's just like a daguerreotype. All that light that's bouncing off at the location is on the object, the final image.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not typically like a really sort of mystical thinker, but there's something about that thingness of it, and the fact that it inhabited the same space, that there's some sort of sense of continuity there.
Right. I think for me, it's not even necessarily historic photo processes. It's more of the act of doing it, the hands-on, the challenge.
Mm-hmm.
I've always kind of been interested in working with my hands, whether it be woodworking and digging. I grew up in the summer times on my farm in Ohio, my grandfather's farm. And, so I have this kind of work ethic that came with that.
Mm-hmm.
And I honestly don't like sitting in front of the computer. I would much rather be outside doing something else than sitting in front of my computer editing photos and trying to make them look good. I'd rather do 10 wet plates of the same scene until I got it right
Mm-hmm.
than be in front of my computer trying to do that other stuff.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing too, like with collodion in particular, with wet plate, like another thing that really distinguishes that from, more current processes, even film, that you don't have a ton of control over how it's going to look in the end. Like you can control your exposure, but like stuff comes out in the wash that isn't something that you can really direct, as opposed to like a digital photographer can get in there and alter individual pixels, and some people do. But I think that there's something about that sort of randomness to how collodion, how it dries, and how the liquid sort of flows, that it's something. There's something beautiful in that,
Yeah, absolutely. The chemicals, when they come together, I don't want to get too deep into it, but a lot of the wet plate that you see online, has a lot of what's called oystering, and there's just side effects from chemistry. And honestly, 100 years ago, they probably would have discarded that. I mean, you really don't see those on historic tintypes,
mm-hmm.
but the process gained so much popularity in such a short time, like a resurgence of the popularity of it,
mm-hmm.
that it's attractive and people respect it. Those mistakes, I don't want to call them mistakes, because they're just part of the resurgence of this practice. And it might end up getting to a point where people are trying to perfect it again. But at the scene right now, people are accepting
mm-hmm.
of those serendipitous, I guess you could say, chemical nuances.
Yeah, I think it's photography as a technology. I think is really, it's an interesting thing, because that's something where, like nowadays, there's sort of like in a lot of ways, I think people are sort of interested in not even necessarily historical processes, but just with photographs looking old-fashioned,
Yeah, sure.
And I remember, I've heard this a lot of times, that like, for example, when you see people putting like a Polaroid filter on an Instagram photo or something, and that the argument that like that Edwin Land would have like killed to be able to have color reproduction the way that we can get from digital nowadays.
Yeah.
And he would have been very frustrated that everyone is kind of taking what he saw as an imperfection,
right,
and doing it on purpose. To me,
yeah.
I mean, I can kind of like, I can understand that on the one hand, but on the other hand, I kind of feel like it's sort of missing the point of that, like, photography isn't just a technology, and its point isn't just to reproduce reality, but rather it's meant to be expressive. And so
right.
all of the connotations that we have for all of these different ways that photographs can look, they all matter.
Yeah, I agree with that statement. And it's frustrating to get online and see the dismissal of images because of what is considered not perfect,
mm-hmm.
Or not the usual, or not the norm.
Yeah.
In the web plate community or whatever.
Yeah, there is a lot of condescension. Well, I mean, it's the internet, so there's a lot of condescension just in general. But it's another thing too. It's like, I remember having this conversation once with a guy, and he was basically saying, like, if the photograph didn't look like that, then would it still be a good photograph? And it's kind of like, well, if the photograph didn't look like that, it wouldn't be the same photograph. So what's the point of talking about that?
Right.
You know, I don't know. People have got their opinions, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think, you know, with those objects, particularly, you know, when I got to be actually in the room with these cans, these objects, that it really, you know, all art is evocative in some way or another, but like I can't recall very often feeling such a really visceral. I hate the word visceral because people kind of overuse it, but like, you know, just like being able to look at this object and see the image that's on it, and to really feel in a way that, like, to feel like I'm actually there, or that I'm feeling some pull towards the representation, you know?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's what I want. That's what I want people to feel. And as the project continues, I'm still working on it. I kind of am like in phase 2 of it. It's getting to be more of, instead of singular objects, more of construction and in an installation-based sculptures. So I have like anywhere from, you know, 10 to 50 pieces in one piece, not all containing images. And I really want there to be a sense of the location beyond just what I'm photographing. And I think, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and it's something like when you're actually there, and yeah, I mean, obviously we're not like touching them, but like when you're actually able to see like how the rust is flaking off of this particular piece of metal, and you really get a sense of age, and that this thing was actually sitting out in the sun for how many decades.
Right.
And that's, I think, something that as image makers, as photographers, you know, a lot of photographers work in a lot of different ways, and not to say that everybody has to consider stuff like that, but I think that in some ways we can find ourselves sort of limited by our choice of medium, and the way that it sort of constrains the way we end up thinking about it, and being able to think about how stuff like the substrate for your image affects the way it's received is something I think a lot of photographers don't necessarily spend a lot of time thinking about, you know?
Yeah. You know, there's people like Heineken and Rauschenberg that I think really kind of paid attention to image objects. Mm-hmm. And those are two people that kind of stick with me as I'm working and as I'm thinking more conceptually and more sculpturally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I unfortunately don't have a ton, because I never went to art school, so I don't have a ton of like art history education. I know a little bit about Rauschenberg and Heineken, but not a ton. It's something that I've always sort of lamented about having not gone to art school.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't lament. I mean, it's going to happen. You're obviously engaged in the arts, and all that knowledge is going to come to you free. So don't worry about it.
Yeah. I did get a chance to go to the Museum of Contemporary Art yesterday, actually, and they had some stuff from their permanent collection out, and both of those two artists were actually on display. So that was interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. That sort of connection with like sort of an artistic tradition is something that I think about a lot, and how we all sort of influence and inform each other. It's sort of fascinating. I haven't really collected my thoughts on it, but you know, I think a lot of people think about it probably.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just gonna. You go ahead. Yep. It's easier for me to go off of you.
So this. So then, most recently, this actually isn't even completely open on your website. It's on your website, but it's password protected. You have a newer series called Power. And I actually, these were the things that I saw at the Atherton Gallery when I was there. I think this was January of last year.
Okay.
So it's these, you've got what they look like 55-gallon oil drum lids.
Yeah, correct.
And then you're putting images you're using those as your plates to create images of, I think they look like refineries and power generation stations, things like that.
You got it.
Yeah. And that, there again, the choice of substrate that you're using really speaks to the theme and makes you're able to take the image and make it into something that is a lot more physical and that affects the way that we receive it. I think that's just such an interesting idea.
Yeah, so it's a gradual advancement off of my past work, and this series I actually had started building an ultra large format camera to just make large photographs, because this process determines, or the size of the photograph in the end result determines the size of the camera that you need to have to make those photographs of that size.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually built the camera, or was building the camera, while I was working on 36 exposures and conversations with history. And so by the time that the camera was finished, my entire mindset of photography had changed. And so now I'm thinking, well, what can I put in this camera that, continues with, my interests right now?
Mm-hmm.
And environmental has been, a big part of my work in the last two series. And a 55-gallon drum would fit perfectly in there. So I have a portable darkroom truck, and I've been going around to locations in California and Texas and the South, and just moving around, looking at energy and power and oil production, all these things that are have always been majorly important in our lives, and trying to understand them through my own investigation and my own practice in the way I make art.
Yeah, it's an interesting. Art has such a power to communicate, and political art has a long tradition. A lot of us think of stuff from the 60s and 70s, but even going back hundreds of years before that, we have a long tradition of art about issues. I think that what's great about like a series like this one is that it really, like, the best art on issues isn't like a lecture,
Yeah.
And this really, I feel like, particularly in the sort of conversation between the image and the thing that the image is on, really invites the viewer to think about that relationship, and then to think more deeply about how this stuff. I guess because what I'm saying is because the image isn't just an image; it's a thing in the real world. That it invites you to consider other ways that this subject matter is having an effect on the real world. Similarly, with conversations with history.
Yeah, I think that's great interpretation. I think it's true. I think interacting with these places and with these objects, I've grown. I find these places incredibly beautiful and terrifying. And, these are things that we've created, and there's things that we rely on every day. And you don't think about it. You go to the gas pump, you fill up your car, and you go to the places you need to go, and boom, that's out. But when you're in these locations, like in Taft, California, I had this kind of awakening experience because I had visited Yosemite not too long before going to Taft. Taft is an oil refinery town. There's hundreds of jacks pumping at all the time, and the air is thick with oil. And I'm standing there, I'm making this photograph, and I'm thinking to myself, this is the exact opposite of my experience in Yosemite. My experience in Yosemite was like I'm looking up and like in awe of this natural beauty. And then when I go to Taft, it's literally the complete opposite. I'm nervous and frustrated with the air quality, and just like in awe of the disaster that were created there. But at the same time, I know without that, the Industrial Revolution and all this other stuff, and my personal use of this material would be different. And so it's kind of a back and forth pull, I think, that all environmentalists, all environmental artists deal with, because you can't talk about this stuff without using it. So yeah, it's an interesting give and take, and I think I'm definitely more aware of my surroundings and what I do and how I use it because of going and investigating these things. I mean, honestly, I think there should be a tour of some sort, just like you can go to Yosemite. You can go to these places and get that opposite experience. I think everybody should do it. It's powerful.
Yeah, that tension you're describing is something. There's a complexity to it that you're not in the process of making this work and sharing this work. You're not just sort of waggling your finger at everyone, but rather there's a complexity there and a nuance to it that is also. There's always such a temptation when we're talking about important issues to want to see things clearly and in black and white. No pun intended.
Right.
But to say that like we can have strong opinions about these things, and to say that there is a I don't know, a right way to, like, there can be not to say that, I guess what I'm saying is you can acknowledge the complexity without failing to come to a conclusion on these things, and I think that is also something that it requires a certain amount of honesty of analysis that I think a lot of people don't engage with. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean, and I think honestly this is our time and this is our landscape. When you think about early American painting, early 19th century paintings, in that sublime landscape, that awe and beauty, all that stuff is held within a lot of these refineries for me. Like, I look at this and I'm in awe of it, but I'm at the same time terrified of what it is, and the power of it. And so I think trying to convey that in these photographs is ultimately what I'm trying to do. It's not necessarily a critique on us, critique on what we've done. It's more of like an acknowledgement of where we are and what we're doing right now.
So for the second segment, I always invite guests to bring a topic of their own, whatever is on their mind that they might find interesting to talk about. So what would you like to talk about today?
Well, kind of going off of what we've just spoke about with the refineries and things, I've been thinking about permanence and impermanence a lot, not just in the art world and in my art, as because I get that question all the time. How long is this going to last? It's on a rusty object. And I know it'll last hundreds of years. That object was outside for over 50. And if you take care of it and the way I've treated it, it's going to last a long time. But I guess what I'm thinking about is none of this is permanent. And, we try as artists we understand that none of it's permanent, but we're trying to have longevity and we're trying to make our work last longer than our lives and kind of continue and going. But I don't know. That's kind of just one of the things that has been on my mind a lot.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think, a lot of people, not just artists, I mean, people in general, are often very concerned with legacy and things like that.
Right.
I think there's a thing about photography in particular, more than maybe any other art form, that sort of lends itself to thinking about that kind of thing. And I think, there have been a lot of people who have written about about photography and the sort of philosophy of photography, from like Sontag to Barth to like all kinds of people. And one of the common things that you keep coming up is this idea that photography is really about time, like fundamentally about time.
Yeah.
In a way that maybe other forms, even visual forms, aren't really about time as explicitly, you know? So
yeah, absolutely.
I think there's a thing about that where we're really something about a photographic capture and it being like some slice of light and time and exposure that, you know, the moment that you're capturing is ephemeral, but then the object you're left with is more durable.
Right.
It really, yeah, I think about that kind of stuff all the time too.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. I mean, the notion of photography and the act of it is just such a romantic, beautiful idea, especially when you consider like what you're able to capture and what you're able to hang on to, the memories or representation of what is going on around you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's something, you know, I mean, and I think in some way that there's something fundamental about the human experience to ponder, you know, what lasts and what doesn't, and, you know, to have a certain anxiety about that.
Sure. Maybe it's my age and the fact that I just got married and things I'm thinking about right now. But, yeah, or even, you know, the musicians that have passed away this year. It's like all this stuff is just kind of compiled on my brain right now.
Yeah, well, you're not that old.
Yeah, I'm almost 40. Yeah. Yes, I'm 36, so I round up.
I've been doing that as well. I'm 37, so, yeah, music too is. I was thinking about music and recorded music the other day. How fundamentally weird it is to be listening to somebody that isn't in the room with you, you know?
Right.
And there's something about that where, like, because my grandfather, my mom's dad, was really into music, and he was particularly into music from when he was young. He was born in the 1920s, and so one of the ways I bonded with him was over, like, you know, early jazz and swing music and stuff like that. So I have all these old tapes that he recorded from his records for me, of like Count Basie and Glenn Miller and stuff, and it's one of those things that I remember I never thought about when I was a kid, but now that I'm getting a little older, I think about the fact that, like, these sounds are coming to me from the past, you know?
Yeah.
It's so weird.
Never get rid of those.
Yeah.
Pass those on to your kids.
Yeah, unfortunately, I no longer own a tape deck, but I still have all the tapes.
I'll pick one up for you at Goodwill.
Yeah, I was actually just last night. I went to my family's out of town, so I went to a music show last night at the San Diego Art Institute, and they were selling tapes there of, like, the bands were selling tapes, and I was like, I would love to have this tape, but I don't know what I would do with it.
Right. Yeah. And there's always someone that's going to keep the tradition alive.
Yeah.
I guess that kind of goes back to the historic photo processes.
Yeah, it is interesting. Like, I remember when CDs came out, because you would remember this too. We would have been, I don't know, in middle school or so when CDs started to come out, and how everyone was so thrilled that you didn't have to deal with tape hiss anymore, and that you could, you could fast forward right to the track you wanted, and everybody loved that. And so it is a little strange to see people returning to that medium that, like, none of us really liked that much at the time, but now we're nostalgic about it, you know?
Yeah, it's true. It's funny. I saw this this little blurb on Facebook, and it was a picture of a tape cassette next to a pencil, and it was like, if you know the relationship between these two, you're of this certain age or whatever. It's like, oh my god, it's true.
Yeah. Yeah, so the internet is real good at finding ways to make you feel old.
Maybe that's it. Maybe less internet.
Yeah. But, I mean, there is something also, I mean, we can have this recognition that nothing lasts, that someday the sun is going to explode and all this is not going to be here anymore. But I still, we still all do the things that we're doing. And as artists, we still make the art. We still put it out there. And I think there's something fundamentally hopeful about that,
Sure. I think for artists, it's like you can't survive without creating. If you can go a week or, a day without thinking creatively or thinking about another idea or something, then, maybe it's not all, maybe it's just something you do rather than something you need to do. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I think art is definitely, for the most people that are actively doing it, is a need to do it. You need to do this thing regardless of permanence or impermanence or what will happen tomorrow. It's like today is what matters and what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I often wonder, like, that impulse to create is something, I definitely feel it myself. I remember my wife and we were driving back. I think it actually might have been driving back from Tucson that time that I saw your work at the Etherton Gallery. And she just we were talking about something and I was excited about something. And she just kind of gave me this look and said, well, you really can't not do this, can you? And I thought, yeah, I really can't. I really just have to be doing this all the time. And I wonder so much, like, where that comes from, like why? Because like lots of people have no problem with just like, not doing it.
Right.
Even people sometimes that will do it occasionally, and I just don't know how that, even if I'm not working on something, I'm thinking about working on something,
Totally.
I wish I could understand where that drive comes from. I don't know. It's probably not one thing.
No, it probably isn't. I think history your personal history kind of shapes who you are. So somewhere down the line, whether it be your parents or your grandparents influenced you in one way or another, and then the rest is just kind of made up by who you are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, thinking about why I am the way I am has taken up a lot of time and money.
Sure.
Yeah, it keeps my therapist employed. Yeah, it's funny. One of the things that I think about related to permanence has to do with that, like for me, and for a lot of people I know, a lot of people I've talked to, that the really amazing thing about art is the way that it's a communication between the artist and the audience, that it provides this point of connection. And for me, that has most often come, either when I see other people's work, that's one thing, but when it comes to my own work, having that connection often comes in the form of literal conversations that I have with people who've seen my work, and that's very valuable to me. But thinking about how my work could, in theory, I don't know if it will, but could in theory outlive me, and that somebody, decades or after I die might be involved in a conversation with me.
Right.
It's a strange thing to think about. I guess it's sort of the flip side of the thing I was saying about the music.
Yeah, I think it's so great. I think it is phenomenal. When my work first got collected by the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, they were the first museum to purchase my work. I thought about that a lot. Like, oh my God, somebody is literally going to care for this work until the end of days. It might not always be shown, but somebody could access it if they wanted to. Like, there's a physical record that it's here, and that to think about that is kind of like, it's mind blowing. And I think it's what artists want. I mean, to have your idea kind of archived and respected and sought after for for eternity. It sounds wild, but just to have that little note. Yeah, I think writers and musicians, obviously musicians, are the same way.
Yeah.
All the arts.
It's funny because one of the things that is this is true even if you're talking about how art is received in the contemporary moment, like you make the art and it's received in the same moment. But, when I think about like what the art will mean in the future, is going to be something different from what it means now. And like I say, like everybody is going to come to it differently even now. Like different people will have different experiences and lenses with which they view your work.
Sure.
But, imagine like 100 or 200 years goes by and then thinking about how those people may or may not, it's not something that I guess we can really completely understand, but it's kind of wild to think about.
It is. I agree. Kind of thinking about my conversations with history, it's like, I guess I don't really know how long that would last in a cared facility.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I do know that I've had objects, that are 4 or 5 years old sitting around my studio that I've kind of kept for my own that haven't changed since the day I made them.
Yeah.
And I think it's looking at the history of wet plate and the history of a tintype. If you care for it, it can be as good as the day it was made up till now. Mm-hmm. So we really don't know the longevity of those objects. All we know is that, it's over 100 years old and it's as good as the day it was made.
Yeah. Yeah. With your stuff, what you're doing, you can be reasonably assured that if people take care of it, it will outlast you because, we have tintypes that are way older than the human lifespan.
Right. Exactly.
That's, with something like a more traditional print, particularly color prints. That's another story.
Yep.
It is sort of interesting to think about too, like because so many of us work digitally now, how that stuff will or won't continue to be accessible over time.
That's definitely. I'm sure that's in everybody's mind in concern photography, but I don't think you dwell on it while you're here on Earth, while you're doing it. I think people are doing what comes, naturally to the advancement of the technology. And I think it's definitely something, generations down the line that they're going to have to deal with. Like, oh my God, how do we save this?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do we keep it? And we've done that with daguerreotypes,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, how do we preserve this? So it's that honestly is all part of the history of photography, is trying to keep it, since the day it was invented. Like, how do I keep this?
Yeah.
I think that hasn't changed at all.
Yeah. I got to sit in a lecture with the Center for Creative Photography at U of A.
Right.
And they have a whole bunch of people involved with conservatorship, with preservation of works, and they're definitely thinking about how to preserve digital works right now, even.
Yeah, so, they have to, for sure.
Yeah. So it's good to know that people are on the job. Anyway, well, I think that we can probably wrap it up. Is there anything else that you'd like to cover before we go?
I don't know. If there is, I'd just like to say thank you. And I think what you're doing with your podcast is just wonderful, and I feel privileged to be invited to partake.
Well, thank
if
you.
If I could go back and add to some of the questions, I probably would, but you know how these things go. They're conversations, and what you say is what you get. So maybe a follow-up sometime.
Yeah. Where can people, if they want to know more about you, where can they look?
DavidEmmittAdams.com is my website. I have work at the Etherton Gallery, and I have work at the Photo Eye Gallery in Santa Fe. I have my first exhibition of power work is coming up in 2017 at the Roswell Museum of Art.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mike. Really appreciate it.
So there we go. That was my conversation with David Emitt Adams. I definitely recommend at least checking out his website, and there's a link to that in the show notes. But as you heard, you really do need to see this work in person to get the full impact. So if you have the opportunity to get to the Etherton Gallery in Tucson or the Photo Eye Gallery in Santa Fe, it's 100% worth it, so definitely do it. And that is our show. If you have questions or comments about anything we talked about today, or really just about anything at all, you can email me at podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com, or you can find me in the show on Twitter at ChannelOpenPod, or on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechanneleopen. I want to take a second to thank everyone who has left a review on iTunes, because that is a really big help. And if you haven't done that yet, even just a few sentences is great. Also, make sure to subscribe to the show if you're enjoying it, which you can do through iTunes or Stitcher or your favorite podcast app. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. Next time, I'm excited to be bringing you our very first conversation with a curator, and that will be Chantel Paul of the SDSU Downtown Gallery, so be sure to come back for that. And as always, remember, keep the channel open.